I think printmakers are hooked by that often really early on, and then they tend to work in that way because it's really kind of quite addictive.
Hello, print friends, and welcome. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf, and I release weekly episodes with people around the world who share our love of printmaking. If you like what we do, please rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts. It really does make a difference. Or just tell a fellow print friend about the podcast so they can enjoy it too. We also have a Patreon page where supporters can join at tiers that start at just $1 a month, and that helps us to keep bringing you printmaking content every week. You can also get thank yous like exclusive merch, as well as access to our bonus content, Shop Talk with our editor, Timothy Pauschak. These are quick and dirty tips and tricks with our guests about materials, processes, business advice, and general studio nonsense. So, if that sounds like something you're interested in, check out the link in the show notes to sign up and hear Tim's chat with today's guest. And if you want to save a little money and still support the show, you can sign up for a yearly subscription and get 15% off the tier price. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers. Hello Print Friend is brought to you by Speedball Art Products, who've been offering a diverse range of high-quality products to your creative practice since 1997. Products like their new line of professional relief inks, beginning with their flagship color Super Graphic Black, developed with artist printer Bill Fick. Formulated with all the working properties artists demand, these light, fast inks roll out consistently, transfer beautifully, and clean up easily with soap and water. So if you want to take your practice to the next level, head on over to Speedball's website to see where you can pick up a can of your new favorite color. There's a link in the show notes. My guest this week is Katherine Jones, a multi-disciplinary artist working in Brixton. We'll talk about the collagraphic process, perceived and actual safety, international and domestic threats, and a crystal palace. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to throw no stones in your glass houses with Katherine Jones. Hi, Katherine. How's it going?
Hi, Miranda. Good, thank you.
Good. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really looking forward to our chat. I was really delighted when Jenny Robinson introduced your work to me, and I was really taken with it, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about it.
Thanks very much for having me on. It's very nice to be here. It's a great podcast. I've been listening to a few of them. Yeah.
And you're joining me from your studio in Brixton, which you said might have a little bit of authentic ambiance outside with a siren or two. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, we're right next to Brixton Police Station on the main main street. So there will be the odd siren.
Wonderful.
Inevitably. Yeah.
It'll sound very authentic then. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, would you please introduce yourself to our print friends out there and let them know who you are, where you are, and what you do?
So my name's Katherine Jones, and I'm a printmaker and mixed media artist, and I work in London, UK, and at the moment I'm in Brixton in London, in my studio, and yeah, that's it.
Beautiful. I have to admit that one of maybe the only direct association I have with Brixton is the Clash song, The Guns of Brixton. So I don't know if that has any relation to contemporary Brixton or not, but that's when I saw that's where you were, I always, heard that little refrain going through my head.
Yeah, famously there were the Brixton riots in the 80s, and Steve McQueen has actually just done 3 films about the lead up to those riots, which were race riots. And so there is quite a sort of heavy history there, and it's a very mixed culturally, it's a very mixed place, and that makes it extremely interesting. But obviously since then, it's become, a little bit less bouncy, and it's much more, it's much more sedate. And there's still a lot going on culturally around here. And yeah, it's a very lovely place to live, actually.
Wonderful. Well, where did you grow up and what role did art play in that part of your life?
So I grew up in Herefordshire, which is on the border of Wales, for those of you who know Great Britain. And it's very beautiful and sort of soft and green and lots of rain and lots of sheep. And my parents, my father's an academic, and my mum was very into art as a sort of a younger person. So she was one of the first sort of editors of Art Review.
Oh, wow.
And she was always very encouraging. And they sent me to a Steiner school, which is a sort of alternative education school. And also there was a lot of focus on art and on creative learning. So in terms of learning about colour, especially using watercolour, I had quite a good grounding there. And I think that's fed in a lot to the way I use colour in my prints now, because obviously watercolour and printmaking both rely on, the white of the paper. And so the principles are it's very similar in terms of building an image up.
Yeah. That's interesting. I've never heard that connection between the two media expressed so explicitly like that. And it's really true, isn't it? Like that it's not about sort of your canvas being just the only what supports the image. It actually plays a contributing role in the final piece. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that is so important, isn't it? To get those sort of strong light areas on a print. And that is, it's all down to getting, the least amount of ink between the print and the paper, and that contrast between that and the dark. I do lots and lots of etching, but most of my work now is collagraphy, which is the same principle. It's an intaglio print again, but using slightly more sort of rough, basic tools. So using lots of carborundum grit and then making very smooth areas as well. But I love etching, and most of the stuff I did, previously was etching. But as I've sort of got, my work's got larger. I mean, fundamentally, making a huge etching is always quite difficult in terms of the equipment you need and all of that stuff. Whereas a carborundum print can be made to any scale, and it can be cut in half and printed in two sections, and then put together again. There's a lot more leeway.
Yeah. And it really makes sense what you're saying about having that early exposure to watercolor, because while your works, they're printmaking, they have that kind of gentleness that you maybe usually see in something like mokuhanga woodcut, in the sense that sometimes I think people associate print with this really graphic kind of hard quality, with like the high contrast and the hard edges, and then working in grayscale. And your works really has a bit of a, I don't know if softer touch is really the word or the connotation like you would welcome for it, but for lack of a better word, like a little bit more of that kind of gentle feel that you see in something maybe more like a watercolor. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably more painterly. And I think recently, especially, I've been trying to introduce that more and more, and also to work again onto the prints once they've been made and dried, and introduce real brush marks into those images. I really like that connection between processes. I've always made prints and I love printmaking, but I'm really more interested in the images that you can make using that medium, using the line you get from an etching, that emboss, and again, everybody gets addicted to those things. It's an absolute, I can completely understand, that thing, because once you've got that embossed line or embossed image that's intrinsic to the piece of paper, especially with an intaglio print. There's something really nice and sort of seductive about it. And you get all of those textures are transferred. I almost think it's a bit of a shame often to see prints under glass,
Yeah.
Because there is a certain amount that you lose through seeing them like that. And it's so exciting when you go to a collection like here in London. We have a really wonderful collection at the Tate and also at the V&A, that you can go and you can look at the prints in the drawers, and you can handle them, and you can see them up close, the Rembrandts and just all sorts of wonderful prints there. So yeah, that's really the way I prefer to view them.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I feel like prints under glass, it's our catch-22, right? Because if you want them on your walls, they need to be safe. They need to be safe from, light and cooking oil smoke and dust and, all the things, right, that can damage a print. But there's really nothing quite like the intimacy of just holding a print in your hand and seeing, as you say, the way the paper has been altered and become textural and these like very low relief sculpture marks, and how that all can truly add to the finished piece in a way that when it's in its safe little box behind glass on the wall, it can still be very beautiful and very rewarding, but it does create a distance every time. Absolutely.
No, it does.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've always been jealous of painters who paint in oil for that reason, that, you have all of that history of the brush mark. Mm-hmm. With painters like Prunella Clough, who I really love, who's a British abstract painter. She worked on canvases sort of for years and sort of built up, and you could see the impasto, you could see all of these layers coming through. Whereas with a print, you often scrape away what you don't want, mm-hmm. and redo it, or cut away and replace. And so that history kind of gets diminished a little bit. But at least seeing it, in real life, and without glass, you kind of get a little bit more information about the process it's gone through to become what it is. Mm-hmm. And I love that.
Yeah. So where were you introduced to printmaking and developed this deep relationship with it?
You know what? I did an art foundation course when I was 16, 17, maybe 18. Yeah, 18. At Hereford College of Art, which is a really good art college, actually, but fairly small, very near my hometown where I grew up. And there was a technician called Roger Briggs, and he just taught me the rudiments of collagraph and etching, and also, really importantly, he taught me how to clean up, which sounds ridiculous and sounds like a sort of, an extra thing. But he taught me how to clean up, which meant that I didn't see printmaking as some onerous task that had to be, where you had to really think about whether it was worth getting all these inks out and doing it. He showed me how to clean up really, really easily. So that just was never a problem. And I think, he was great for lots of different reasons. Classic grumpy technician. Sadly, no longer with us. But he was, I think really fundamentally he was great. And then there have been obviously several tutors since then in art colleges in London and my contemporaries. That's always been a drive as well.
Yeah. And it's really wonderful to hear the way you talk about printmaking as well, because I can tell that you're an artist who really appreciates it for the unique qualities that it can bring to a finished work. And this is a theme that comes up a few times in the podcast, talking to people about the misconception that people have that the only reason why you'd make a print is because you would make a painting, but you want more than one. I always love when an artist can speak to the way an etching makes a line where it becomes a part of the paper in a way that there's no other process that will do that. And then you get to interact with that line in a completely different way than you would if it was made with a pen on paper or oil paint or anything like that. It really brings its own voice, and at which point you can then add other voices to create the finished look that you want. And it doesn't necessarily have to come down just to the fact that you can pull an edition of 10. There's so much more that printmaking does. And it sounds like you, really understand that and celebrate print for its ability to do that.
Definitely. I mean, it gives you things that no other technique can give you. And that, I think printmakers get that sort of, are hooked by that often really early on, and then they tend to work in that way because it's really kind of quite addictive. But I do think that printmaking is having a sort of, in London anyway, I'm feeling like printmaking, there's a lot of misunderstanding still around it, and that will always be the case, obviously, because there's so many different forms of printmaking, and it's a complex thing to get your head around, much more complex than putting a brush on a piece of paper, or a pen, or drawing it, with a pen on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are other stages. But I think it's so important. I do quite a lot of teaching, and I think it is so important to introduce people to printmaking, and just as a way of explaining as well that what an original print is. That it's not a giclée of a painting that has been made by like you said, and making a copy of something that's already made in another format or another medium is sort of irrelevant to fine art printmaking. I'm completely, I very much like digital printmaking, and I think that's fantastic. As if you're working on a print as a print, then it should, work in whatever format or whatever media you like. But it's that sort of fundamental understanding about, the conception of something being in a particular medium. So if something's conceived as a digital print, then of course it should be printed digitally. Yeah, fine.
No, I think that is a really important distinction that I haven't actually heard anyone say before so directly, because it's really that part of the reason why I think people turn their nose up at giclée reproductions, and maybe they didn't even know it, is, as you say, it wasn't intended to be in that form. So it takes something away from the artist's intent and from the authenticity of the image, truly. And so
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And I've seen beautiful digital prints. I really have. But it's probably for the very reason that when the artist set out to create something, they were thinking of, what can I do in this medium that really makes this medium sing, that's really going to fulfill the strengths of this medium. And then when you see it, it's like, well, okay, well, that's quite nice. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
So to chat a little bit more about your work specifically, I know that it speaks to this sort of tension between safety and danger and perceived security and vulnerability. And I just would find this topic incredibly fascinating for a bunch of reasons. But I'm hoping that you could speak to what brought you to that directly, and how you go about exploring that through the particular images that you use.
So I think what's happened is that it's always been there, but I've just recognized it over the years. And, when you have to write about your work, you realize that the same topics come up over and over again. And, as when I was doing my degree, and a little bit after that, I was a fellow in printmaking at the City and Guilds of London Art School, which has a wonderful sort of toxic etching room and proper nitric and everything like that, very old style. And I was working on a series of images of shelters, and they were really, I suppose, based on something that was in the air at the time politically. We were going into the Iraq War, and there was a lot of rhetoric around about what would be safe for our country, for us, for the world. What everybody was planning to do to keep us safe from these perceived dangers, which were very real, but weren't necessarily being dealt with in the right way. And I was just conscious of that as I was making these kind of little metaphors, I suppose, for that the fragility of safety and what our perceptions are of a safe space. And they turned out looking very much like greenhouses or like glass houses, which was a completely fitting visual metaphor for that stage. and hasn't stopped being fitting for that sort of idea ever since. So that idea of something that's very welcoming, looking warm, safe, and at the same time very fragile, vulnerable, and insecure, so it has kind of continued. So the work that I've continued to do, whether it's made using these motifs or not, the latest work has been about flowers and gardens and clouds, a lot of sort of very sort of transient things. But it's always come back to those core things, those core elements, questioning safety, security, and what it is, and how vulnerable we really are, and how grateful we should be really for the now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if the last 18 months has taught us nothing, hey? Like it's really thinking about the worries that took up most of my mind 2 years ago compared to the worries that take up most of my worried mind now, it's completely different. I mean, I think like all of us, you worry about maybe getting sick or your family getting sick in a general sort of way. Like, wouldn't that be terrible if I suddenly got a call and, someone has gotten very ill unexpectedly? But you also have that, many people I think walk around with that, albeit false, but nonetheless sense of security that doesn't happen to my family, that happens to other people. That's just something you read about. Oh, sure, that happened to my friend, but it won't happen to me. And it's truly what kind of makes it so you can get up in the morning, is that if you really woke up fully knowing how fragile things were, it would be very, very difficult to put your feet to the ground and walk out the door. Truly. Yeah.
I think the other thing, conversely, I think the other thing that, lockdown taught us was that the earth is pretty incredible, that people were really looking at the world directly outside their front door, and how things were kind of springing to life a lot more. I mean, in Brixton, for instance, I'd never noticed the birds as much as I did during lockdown. There was no cars on the road for a long time, and there was just this regeneration of life. And obviously the first lockdown, I think we were coming into spring, so that was happening automatically a little bit, but it was quite optimistic. I felt quite optimistic about how, the title of the show that I'm just about to do is The Iron in the Earth, and I think that sort of was, again, reflecting on the fact that the earth's very strong, and it can rejuvenate and regenerate if we let it.
Yes. Yeah. I had a mentor, must have been, I think it was when I was in high school. It was actually my martial arts sensei who said at one point, I think I was taking Kung Fu as a 16-year-old. Certainly 100% inspired by Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and wanting to be strong and safe, and I was wearing some shirt about the environment, and I remember he said something like, no, people don't want to save the earth. They want to save humans. The earth is going to be fine, and it really, I remember it very clearly kind of planting this seed of, oh, right. Like, we're really, like, this is really about us, because if we all suddenly disappeared, what would really benefit is actually the earth.
Absolutely.
Well,
what a wise guy.
Well, it's interesting, sort of speaking of the sort of elements of safety and danger and security, and just that little anecdote reminded me of it. I'm curious for how much of that you think maybe sparks your interest, or certainly sparks my interest, if I can just speak from the eye, which is being a woman in the world and having a narrative from a very young age that your safety is your responsibility, that you are in constant danger, that you are inherently a victim, like just waiting. You're basically like a victim waiting for a perpetrator. And that it really takes up a lot of your brain power from a young age when you're socialized female to be concerned about safety.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I could go on a big feminist rant here.
Well, please don't let me stop you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that tenacity, and I think you hear it from a lot of female artists. I mean, especially as far as I know, I'm not in any other fields particularly, but from my perspective as a female artist, yeah, I mean, you do have to shout a little bit louder and be a bit more tenacious, and you do have to kind of, you have to know those things that, there are certain things that privileges that are not automatically afforded to you that you might have to fight a little bit harder for. I mean, it's probably held me back in lots of ways, I don't know, but I feel like it's also a privilege to be a female in the art world, in our world, as printmakers. I think it's almost something, I mean, it's always going to be there. It's almost something that gives you a bit of fight, and the fight is very good for the work.
I like that. Yeah. 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 It's, and it's something that I do know too. It creates, I think, incredible bonds in the art world as well. When you connect with another woman who's out there, who's doing the fight, it can be a really amazing experience too. And that's not something I would ever want to give up, for sure, is the sisterhood is powerful element of getting to be on this journey. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've done a couple of collaborations recently so one was with a sculptor, Helen Bath, who's a brilliant sculptor. And we started off the collaboration actually just having conversations. We didn't do any work for the first, 3 or 4 days that we'd sort of met up, 3 or 4 sessions. We talked about our shared experiences of motherhood and of being a woman and the things that we wanted to communicate. And it was, for that reason alone, it was such a fantastic thing to do. And eventually we did end up making a piece together, which was exhibited at Rabley Gallery, and absolutely have loved the whole experience, and it completely expanded the way that I thought about my work as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm curious if we could speak to for a bit this idea of using this image of the house. And you said, you kind of came across it and realized it was a really good metaphor for what you're going for in terms of a greenhouse. But it certainly shows up time and again in your work in different ways, in the background and the foreground. And I'm wondering if you could kind of speak to all the different sort of implications that a house has, because it is such an interesting symbol. You can go all kinds of different ways with it. And do you really see it as a really versatile kind of iconography, or does it tend to play the same role every time it turns up in your pieces?
No, it genuinely does always play a different role. And I think, you can go down the first route I went down after sort of finding out that what I was making was something that looked like a glass house, and people were saying, what are these glass houses? And I decided to do some proper research on the earliest glass houses and how they evolved. And it turned out that they were very much connected with the voyages of discovery, which were the slave routes. They were called the voyages of discovery because, they also discovered lots of plants and different foods and vegetables and things like that. But really, they were funded by the slave trade, which is a hugely dark history that we've only just really started to understand, and thanks to Black Lives Matter and all of those movements, I think that's the most important thing that's come out of it for me, is to have access to all of this history that's coming out constantly now. And so doing that research into Joseph Paxton, who is one of the first people that put together this huge building, which was made out of glass and was a huge modular building called the Crystal Palace, which stood in Hyde Park during the Great Exhibition in the mid 1800s. And it was something he basically originated or pioneered a lot of the glass making in huge sheets of glass for this thing. but there was a lot of history that went before that, and he was the person that made the first domestic glasshouse, and that was in order to encourage people to propagate vegetables and fruit that came from different countries around the world, right, that he had brought in. So the first domestic greenhouses were sort of made by him, pioneered by him, and they graduated from an A-frame to a standard glass house that you'd see today. So that was just one little thing. Yeah. But then every single time a new house appears, it's normally for a completely different reason, and they vary so much. But of course, it's quite a universal. A dwelling or a shelter is such a universul symbol, I suppose. So it's infinitely useful. Yeah.
Yeah. That's there's just so many different things. I feel like you can take it in so many different ways to interpret, as you say, a shelter or a dwelling, because it's such a fundamental part of, not even just being a human, but like being a mammal, Yes. Whether you're a mouse that hides under a leaf, during a rainstorm, or, or humans who build these incredibly complex structures, or sky high apartment buildings that you see in places like Shanghai and Beijing that are just impossibly large, human holders, basically.
Yeah.
And everyone comes with those associations as well, with this idea of shelter and home and of a safe place. And, for me, looking at your images and kind of knowing that it has to do with the sort of perceived and an actual danger, I took it to, and through some of your images, these ideas of the danger that takes place in the domestic, and this sense that, women are constantly told, be careful, walk with your car keys, always be alert, don't wear that skirt, don't wear heels in case you have to run. But as grim as it is, they're much more likely to be killed by their partners than by a stranger. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And so we're given this narrative of like, the world out there is dangerous, watch yourself, always be on guard, but it's actually inside. It's actually the most dangerous place for women statistically is in their homes. And it's the same for children as well. You get these horrible stories of stranger danger snatchings, which of course happen, but the vast majority of physical and sexual abuse happen within a child's home. So the vulnerable people that we get told, we have to protect them. This is their, it's our job as a society to make sure we have streetlights on the street, which yes, of course, put streetlights on the street so people can be safe. But also we need to be honest about where is actually the dangerous places are. And that's in the shelter. Yeah.
I think that's it. I haven't made any work explicitly about those themes, but it all feeds in, and I think that is it. It's about honesty. It's about being honest with yourself about, how safe we really are. It's not an entirely negative view. It's just about maintaining that balance and understanding that we're not safe in our world. But we're not, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But just to remember that we're not balanced, we're not kind of completely secure at all times, and just to be aware of the rest of the of what's going on in your environment is really important too. But yeah, the honesty thing is huge, and absolutely. The things that we see are only a tiny percentage of the things that really go on.
Yeah. I'd love it if you could speak a bit to this way that you use really beautiful images, really obviously you put a lot of thought into composition, into palettes. There's a wonderful balance to the images. And again, you have these sort of soft markings as well to deal with sort of a hard issue. This very, the safety is very personal. You won't find many things that sort of trigger big emotions in people more than safety, right? Because that's our fundamental little fight, flight, freeze, little lizard brain that's deep within us is that's what it's concerned about, is safety. But you're doing it with this really sort of almost calming imagery at first blush, and then when you return to it, there is a bit of a sense of foreboding. And I don't know, maybe just kind of speak to your aesthetic and how that balances out what is sort of a darker issue, maybe.
So I start off by researching. I mean, I start off by sort of doing a little bit of reading and thinking about and writing, and this is the way it tends to go, although I normally have a few projects on the go at the same time at different stages. And then I will do lots and lots of these tiny little watercolors, and that's to try to format or formulate images, on paper. So to try to put the ideas down in some form on paper. And they are made on the scraps of paper. So I tend to work quite large with my prints, and there's normally a kind of quite a hefty strip of Somerset paper that you rip off the edge, that's not needed. And those pieces, those offcuts, are what I use to make the watercolors, tiny little watercolor sketches. And they are not made to be shown at all. They're just made to generate the first few images. And also I use quite a lot of monoprint to do the same thing, just generating very, very quick, quite spontaneous images. And when I've done enough of those, when I've made enough of those, then I kind of let the image take over a little bit. So the head bit goes first and the heart bit comes later. And I think as I'm working on an individual print, I'll do lots of different, probably, up to 20 proofs of an image in slightly different colors, or, cutting things off, putting things in, and just changing it even quite subtly, numerous times. I sort of feel like nothing really good has ever, or maybe very occasionally, but not very often, come out of doing something straight away. I kind of have to have that sort of almost quite painful process of working through an image until I really feel that it's at the stage where I want to finalize it, edition it, and put it away.
And could you let us know a bit more in detail about what your research process looks like? Because I know particularly for younger artists and artists who are really making that transition between academic life and being working artists, I think that part is really interesting and important for them to hear, how a full grown-up artist really goes about that kind of work of, as you say, the research.
I think, honestly, with me, I've found it really useful to follow my nose, because unless you're really interested in the thing that you're researching, you can do as much reading as you like, but it won't necessarily stick. It won't necessarily stay in your mind. And I think also just really trying to sort of find talk to people that might have some sort of connection to the things you're interested in, go to exhibitions, read a lot, and try to follow the recommendations that people give you, and try to be really honest about your sources. I think this happens quite a lot. I think it's possibly, I was talking to a colleague of mine who I work with the other day, and she was saying that she sort of is worried about the Instagram culture, and I completely understand what she means, about people seeing images and taking them in, sort of absorbing them, but not really realizing where they're coming from or who they're by, because it's such a sort of quick flick, and you end up regurgitating the things that you've seen without knowing where they're really coming from. I think it's kind of try to just keep a track of the references that you're using, that you're really loving, in terms of the visual imagery you're seeing, is really important, and it gives you a bit more of a grounding on where you might end up going, and what your interests are, and how to really research. So I think really using your peers as points of reference, and also always noting down and referencing the people that influence you as well, and being really clear about that and honest, and not trying to pretend it's all your idea.
Right.
Yeah,
that's very important to say, and I think for people to hear, because there is, in our digital age, such a looseness with imagery and where it starts and where it ends up and how it ends up having one meaning, and really just kind of transferring through society just through screenshots and shares, like a meme, truly, where something will be just completely taken out of its context. And that's what memes do, right? That's a kind of a fascinating new element of visual information and connection, and it can be quite funny, and it can be very, very clever, and they just sort of work their way through society, like a little virus or something. But to take that same looseness to something like fine art, when it's not just a stock photo that even has the watercolor on it that's still there, that's been screenshot, that it often make up a meme, but instead it's really someone's true blood, sweat, and tears. It's absolutely not the same thing, even if you're interacting with them in the same space, like something like Instagram. Yeah.
But I mean, I also think that Instagram, Twitter, all of these things are really useful tools, and if they're used in the right way, they're fantastically good for research. If you follow, you follow the initial lead and try and dig a bit deeper into the sources that you're interested in, I think they can be incredible tools.
Mm-hmm. And if it's anything like, I haven't done fine art research, but I've done art history research, is that when everyone is open and honest in citing their sources, it can lead to really amazing things, because you can find someone and then you can look at their sources and really follow this breadcrumb trail back to something that you would never have discovered on your own, and can really open up something completely new to you that you're really excited about. And as you said, that excitement is what makes good work, and was what is so important to cultivate in your practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also it makes you understand that nothing's original. There are people have always visually referenced other people that they've been influenced in, and so on all the way back. And there's a reason why some things, some very ancient things look very contemporary today. It's because they've been influenced. They've been an influence on so many people throughout history up until now.
So Egon Schiele's, the first time I saw some of his work, I could not believe it wasn't from the 21st century.
Right.
I just was like, this has to be a mistake, like Wikipedia, who's playing this joke on me? But because it felt truly like something you could see in a gallery in Chelsea today.
Absolutely.
And it's so interesting how, as you said, that nothing is original, and artists are constantly referencing and working off of one another, going back to the time before the printing press, when artists would have reference books in order to be able to draw things that they'd been commissioned to. That those reference books were just drawn by another artist. Like someone else had looked at a dog in profile and drawn a dog in profile for that person so they could do it. I do think that artists can get hung up on that, and that really put tremendous pressure on themselves, that if I make something that looks anything like anything I've ever seen before, I'm not a true artist. And that's just such a rough thing to do to yourself.
Yeah, it is. It's very tough. I mean, it can totally go too far the other way as well.
It's true.
But yeah, got to have it. There's a fine line there.
There is. And I think maybe that's why it feels sort of difficult, is that when someone truly is ripping off someone else, you can see it and you can just feel it, right? You can just feel it in your bones when you see a work. You're like, oh, this person's definitely seen some this and that. And I guess and because it's so much more of a feeling than something you could write down and say, if you do this, you're referencing Goya's Disaster of War, but if you move the line 2 centimeters that way, then you're just reproducing it. There's no rule book for it. And so I think that does make it really difficult for artists who live in a bit of a nebulous space like that to just have to trust your instinct and trust, as you say, being honest with yourself and having a community that can kind of help guide you, I think. I want to make sure we get a chance to talk a little bit more about The Iron in the Earth, which is your upcoming exhibition. And you mentioned it in passing, but is there anything more you'd like to say about it? I mean, certainly where it is and when it is always good news. But also about that sort of series of work and about that way it sounds like you're using it to find some hopefulness as well.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I probably should mention that the place that I'm doing it is Rabley Gallery, which is outside of London in Marlborough in the countryside. And it's a very beautiful place, and it's run by a lady called Meryl Ainsley, and she's run a drawing centre and a print workshop there, as well as a very beautiful gallery for a long time, where she's had several artists in residence, and I was one of those in 2016. And I've kind of worked with her for quite a long time. She's brought together a wonderful group of artists, a lot of which are printmakers, like Emma Stibben and Rebecca Salter, who and Sarah Lee. I mean, there's so many of them, and it just formed a really fantastic community around that place. It's very special. So yeah, but for the show, I've made over the last 3-ish years actually. I've been making work. I mean, along with, it turns out, everybody else who's an artist and experienced lockdown have made work about plants and growth and new life. And I mean, I'm noticing Damien Hirst and David Hockney have kind of almost identical work at the moment that's come out of exactly then. But so I started making these pieces. I mean, the ideas for them probably came out of the residency while I was there, and some of the drawings I made there. So it's situated on a huge farm in Wiltshire, and you sort of have the run of the farm to go and draw in and take photographs and experience. And then you come back to the studio and you can work on the work that you've been drawing up in the studio using print or whatever medium you want. And so some of the work that I'm showing, although it feels kind of like a bit of a body of work, has been brewing for a long time. And other bits, there's quite a lot of it that's been made since the first lockdown. So spring 2019, is that right? 2020. God,
I know.
I'm losing years.
Time has no meaning. Absolutely, yeah.
And then I'm still working on a little bit now. I've got really obsessed with my allotment. I've got a little allotment. I don't know if you have the same system in America, but
like a community garden, kind of.
Exactly. Yeah, so you have a little plot among a lot of other plots, and I live in a flat in London, in Brixton, so it's kind of, there's no garden there. So I get to go to this very beautiful place surrounded by nature and other people growing things. And I've been there an awful lot recently and drawn a lot. And the work has really come out of that kind of really positive feeling that I found there. And it's just sort of I've really just drawn what I've seen, although the work has become quite distorted and you wouldn't know that it was drawing from life at all. But yeah, and they all go through the process I described earlier, where, and I make lots of watercolors, lots of sketches, and then they get made into prints. So I make them into these intaglio prints and then slowly work them into final images. And during that process, they do become almost completely different things. You kind of end up being led a little bit by the image itself and having to trust it a little bit and see where it goes.
I always like that description as a way of art making is when artists speak about the images they're making as really being collaborators in the finished project. So using words like you said, like let the image lead you a little bit, let it see where it needs to go. And that, as you said, that that you leading with the head and then letting the heart kind of take over. And I think a lot of developing a practice for artists is understanding that push and pull that you're speaking to of, when does your head need to be involved? When does your heart? When does your intuition? It's almost like, learning to ride a horse or something. When do you use a heavy hand? When do you use a light touch? When can you be firm and soft? And it just has this really wonderful sort of metaphor of the work creating itself, but then also you stepping into it. So yeah, thank you for describing the practice that way. It was really nice to hear. Yeah.
I think also with printmaking, because it has a natural rhythm, you do have periods where you've really just got to get down to editioning and making, and that gives you a bit of a meditation time, sort of time to think about what's next, or what you're doing, what you're making currently, and just having that little bit of space is really valuable, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
It really helps with the process of finishing something off.
Well, I feel like that is a beautiful note to start to wrap up our conversation on, a little wonderful nod to printmaking and its editioning. Can you please tell people, where can they find you? Where can they get in touch? I know you said earlier that you like collaborations and people reaching out. So where could people do that?
So I have a website, which is katherinejones.co.uk, and I work with Rabley Gallery, which is also very easy to find on the internet. I think it's rableygallery.co.uk as well. And I work with several other galleries as well, but I'm on Instagram as katherinejones.pp. I'm not on any other social media because I find Instagram is enough.
It's more than enough, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Katherine, for a lovely chat. And I believe you're going to stick around for a little bit longer and have some shop talk with Tim. Is that correct?
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Miranda. Thanks for inviting me. It's been great.
It's been my pleasure. I look forward to sharing our talk, and we will definitely be in touch.
Thank you.
Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again next week when my guest will be Leslie Dogood of Dogood Press. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing by Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.